History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 4, The Age of Diverging Traditions. Chapter 11, New Limits, New Horizons. The Portuguese pushed steadily south. They began by hugging the African coast, but some of the bolder among them reached the Madeiras and began to settle there already in the 1420s. In 1434, one of their captains passed Cape Bajor, an important psychological obstacle whose overcoming was Henry's first great triumph. 10 years later, they rounded Cape Verde and established themselves in the Azores. By then, they had perfected the Caravel, a ship which used new rigging to tackle headwinds and contrary currents on the home voyage by going right out into the Atlantic and sailing a long semicircular course home. In 1445, they reached Senegal. Their first fort was built soon after. Henry died in 1460, but by then his countrymen were ready to continue further south. In 1473, they crossed the equator, and in 1487, they were at the Cape of Good Hope. Already ahead lay the Indian Ocean. Arabs had long traded across it, and pilots were available. Beyond it lay even richer sources of spices. In 1498, Vasco da Gama dropped anchor at last in Indian waters. By that time, another sailor, the Genoese Columbus, had crossed the Atlantic to look for Asia, confident in the light of Ptolemaic geography that he would soon come to it. He failed. Instead, he discovered the Americas for the Catholic monarchs of Spain. In the name of the West Indies, the modern map commemorates his continuing belief that he had accomplished the discovery of the islands of Asia by his astonishing venture, so different from the cautious, though brave, progress of the Portuguese towards the east around Africa. Unlike them, but unwittingly, he had in fact discovered an entire continent, though even on the much better equipped second voyage, which he made in 1493, he explored only its islands. The Portuguese had reached a known continent by a new route. Soon, though to his dying day Columbus refused to admit it, even after two more voyages and arrival on the mainland, it began to be realized that what he had discovered might not be Asia after all. In 1494, the historic name New World was first applied to what had been found in the Western Hemisphere. Not until 1726, though, was it to be realized that Asia and America were not joined together in the region of the Bering Straits. The two enterprising Atlantic nations tried to come to understandings about their respective interests in a world of widening horizons. The first European treaty about trade outside European waters had been made by Portugal and Spain in 1479, when the Gulf of Guinea was reserved to the Portuguese. Now, they went on to delimit spheres of influence. The Pope made a temporary award based on the division of the world between them along a line 100 leagues west of the Azores. But this was overtaken by the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which gave to Portugal all the lands east of the line of longitude running 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde, and to Spain all those lands west of it. In 1500, a Portuguese squadron on the way to the Indian Ocean ran out into the Atlantic to avoid adverse winds and, to its surprise, struck land which lay east of the treaty line and was not Africa. It was Brazil. Henceforth, Portugal had an Atlantic as well as an Asian destiny, though the main Portuguese effort lay to the east, an Italian in Portuguese service. Amerigo Vespucci soon afterwards ran far enough to the south to show that not merely islands but a whole new continent lay between Europe and Asia by a western route. Before long, it was named after him, America, the name of the southern continent later being extended to the northern too. In 1522, 30 years after Columbus's landfall in the Bahamas, a ship in the Spanish service completed the first voyage round the world. The commander under whom it sailed was Magellan, a Portuguese. He got as far as the Philippines, where he was killed, having discovered and sailed through the straits named after him. 18 of his original shipmates survived to reach Spain again. With this voyage and its demonstration that all the great oceans were interconnected, the prologue to the European age can be considered over. Just about a century of discovery and exploration had changed the shape of the world and the course of history. From this time, the nations with access to the Atlantic would have opportunities denied to the landlocked powers of Central Europe and the Mediterranean. In the first place, this meant Spain and Portugal, but they would be joined and surpassed by France, Holland, and above all, England, a collection of harbors incomparably placed at the center of the newly enlarged hemisphere, all of them easily accessible from their shallow hinterland and within easy striking distance of all the great European sea routes of the next 200 years. The enterprise behind these changes had only been possible because of a growing substratum of maritime skill and geographical knowledge. The new and characteristic figure of this movement was the professional explorer and navigator. Many of the earliest among them were, like Columbus himself, Italian. New knowledge, too, underlay not only the conception of these voyages and their successful technical performance, but also allowed Europeans to see their relationship with the world in a new way. To sum the matter up, Jerusalem ceased to be the center of the world. The maps men began to draw, for all their crudity, are maps which show the basic structure of the real globe. In 1400, a Florentine had brought back from Constantinople a copy of Ptolemy's Geography. The view of the world it contained had been virtually forgotten for 1,000 years. In the 2nd century AD, Ptolemy's world already included the Canaries, Iceland, and Ceylon, all of which found a place on his map, along with the misapprehension that the Indian Ocean was totally enclosed by land. Translation of his text, misleading as it was, and the multiplication of copies, first in manuscript and then in print. There were 6 editions between 1477, when it was first printed, and 1500, were a great stimulus to better map making. The atlas, a collection of engraved and printed maps bound in a book, was invented in the 16th century. More men than ever could now buy or consult a picture of their world. With better projections, navigation was simpler too. Here, the great figure was the Dutchman Gerhard Kramer, who is remembered as Mercator. He was the first man to print on a map of the world, America, and he invented the projection which is still today the most familiar, a map of the world devised as if it were an unrolled cylinder, with Europe at its center. This solved the problem of providing a flat surface on which to read direction and courses without distortion, even if it posed problems in the calculations of distances. The Greeks of the 4th century BC had known the world was a globe, and the making of terrestrial and celestial globes was another important branch of the geographical revolution. Mercator made his first globe in 1541. The most striking thing about this progression is its cumulative and systematic nature. European expansion in the next phase of the world history would be conscious and directed as it had never been before. Europeans had long wanted land and gold, and the greed which lay at the heart of the enterprise was not new. Nor was the religious zeal which sometimes inspired them and sometimes cloaked their springs of action, even from the actors themselves. What was new was a growing confidence derived from the knowledge and success. Europeans stood in 1500 at the beginning of an age in which their energy and confidence would grow seemingly without limit. The world did not come to them, they went out to it and took it. The scale of such a break with the past was not to be seen at once. In the Mediterranean and Balkans, Europeans still felt threatened and defensive. Navigation and seamanship still had far to go. Not until the 18th century, for example, would there be available a timekeeper accurate enough for exact sailing. But the way was opening to new relationships between Europe and the rest of the world and between European countries themselves. Discovery would be followed by conquest and then, in due time, by the exploitation of vast new overseas resources by Europeans. A world revolution was beginning. An equilibrium which had lasted 1,000 years was dissolving. As the next 2 centuries unrolled, thousands of ships would be put out year after year, day after day, from Lisbon, Seville, London, Bristol, Nantes, Antwerp, and many other European ports in search of trade and profit in other continents. They would sail to Calicut, Canton, Nagasaki. In time, they would be joined by ships from places where Europeans had established themselves overseas, from Boston and Philadelphia, Batavia and Macau. And during all that time, not one Arab was to find its way to Europe. It was 1848 before a Chinese junk was brought to the Thames. Only in 1867 would a Japanese vessel cross the Pacific to San Francisco, long after the great sea lanes had been established by the Europeans. The European mind. In 1500, Europe is clearly recognizable as the center of a new civilization. Before long, that civilization was to spread to other lands too. Its heart was still religion. The institutional implications of this have already been touched upon. The church was a great force of social regulation and government, whatever vicissitudes its central institutions had suffered. But it was also the custodian of culture and the teacher of all men, the vehicle and vessel of civilization itself. Since the 13th century, the burden of recording, teaching, and study, so long borne by the monks, had been shared by friars and, more important still, by a new institution in which friars sometimes played a big part, the universities. Bologna, Paris, and Oxford were the first of them. By 1400, there were 53 more. They were new devices both for concentrating and directing intellectual activity and for education. One result was the revivifying of the training of the clergy. Already in the middle of the 14th century, half the English bishops were graduates. But this was not the only reason why universities had been set up. The Emperor Frederick II founded the University of Naples to supply administrators for his South Italian kingdom. And when in 1264 Walter de Merton, an English bishop and royal servant, founded the first college at Oxford, among his purposes was that of providing future servants for the crown. The university's importance for the future of Europe, though, was greater than this, though it could not have been foreseen and proved in one respect incalculable. Their existence assured that when laymen came to be educated in substantial numbers, they too would long be formed by an institution under the control of the church and suffused with religion. Furthermore, Universities would be a great uniting cosmopolitan cultural force. Their lectures were given in Latin, the language of the church, and the lingua franca of educated men. Its former preeminence is still commemorated in the vestigial Latin of university ceremonies and the names of degrees. Law, medicine, theology, and philosophy all benefited from the new institutions. Philosophy had all but disappeared into theology in the early medieval period. Only one important figure stands out: John Scotus, Gina, an Irish thinker and scholar of the ninth century. Then, as direct translation from Greek to Latin began in the 12th century, European scholars could read for themselves works of classical philosophy. The text became available from Islamic sources. As the works of Aristotle and Hippocrates were turned into Latin, they were at first regarded with suspicion. This persisted until well into the 13th century, but gradually a search for reconciliation between the classical and Christian accounts of the world got underway, and it became clear, above all, because of the work of two Dominicans, Albertus Magnus and his pupil Thomas Aquinas, that reconciliation and synthesis were indeed possible. So it came about that the classical heritage was recaptured and rechristened in Western Europe. Instead of providing a contrasting and critical approach to the theocentric culture of Christendom, it was incorporated into it. The classical world began to be seen as the forerunner of the Christian. For centuries, man would turn for authority in matters intellectual to religion or to the classics. Of the latter, it was Aristotle who enjoyed unique prestige. If it could not make him a saint, the church at least treated him as a kind of prophet. The immediate evidence was the remarkable systematic and rationalist achievement of medieval scholasticism, the name given to the intellectual effort to penetrate the meaning of Christian teaching. Its strength lay in its embracing sweep, displayed nowhere more brilliantly than in the Summa Theologica of Aquinas, which has been judged contrastingly for both its crowning achievement and a brittle synthesis. It strove to account for all phenomena. Its weakness lay in its unwillingness to address itself to observation and experiment. Christianity gave the medieval mind a powerful training in logical thinking, but only a few men, isolated and untypical, could dimly see the possibility of breaking through authority to a truly experimental method. Nevertheless, within the Christian cultural achievement, the first signs of liberation from the enclosed world of the early Middle Ages can be seen. Paradoxically, Christendom owed them to Islam, though for a long time there was a deep suspicion and fear in the attitudes of ordinary men towards Arab civilization. There was also ignorance. Before 1100, one medievalist has pointed out there is no evidence that anyone in northern Europe had ever heard the name of Muhammad. Not until 1143 was a Latin translation of the Quran available. Easy and tolerant relationships between the faithful and the infidel, both sides thought in the same terms, were possible only in a few places. In Sicily and Spain, above all, the two cultures could meet. There, the great work of translation of the 12th and 13th centuries took place. The Emperor Frederick II was regarded with the deepest suspicion because, although he persecuted heretics, he was known to welcome Jews and Saracens to his court at Palermo. Toledo, the old Visigothic capital, was another specially important center. In such places, scribes copied and recopied the Latin texts of bestsellers of the next 6 centuries. Euclid's works began a career of being copied, recopied, and then printed, which may well have meant that in the end they surpassed the success of any book except the Bible, at least until the 20th century, and became the foundation of mathematics teaching in Western Europe until the 19th century. In such ways, the Hellenistic world began again to irrigate the thought of the West. Roughly speaking, the Islamic transmission of antiquity began with astrology, astronomy, and mathematics, subjects closely linked to one another. Ptolemy's astronomy reached the West by this route and was found a satisfactory basis for cosmology and navigation until the 16th century. Islamic cartography was in fact more advanced than European for most of the Middle Ages, and Arab sailors used the magnet for navigation well before the European counterparts, though it was the latter who were to carry through the great oceanic discoveries. The astrolabe had been a Greek invention, but its use was spread in the West by Arab writings. When Chaucer wrote his treatise on its use, he took as his model an earlier Arab one. The arrival from Arab sources of a new numeration and the decimal point was perhaps most important of all. The latter's usefulness in simplifying calculations can be easily tested by trying to write sums in Roman numerals. Of the sciences of observations other than astronomy, the most important to come to the West from Islam was medicine. Besides providing access to the medical works of Aristotle, Galen, and Hippocrates, direct translation from the Greek was not begun until after 1100. Arab sources and teachers had brought into European practice a huge body of therapeutic, anatomical, and pharmacological knowledge built up by Arab physicians. The prestige of Arab learning and science made easier the acceptance of more subtly dangerous and subversive ideas. Arab philosophy and theology too began to be studied in the West. In the end, even European art seems to have been affected by Islam, for the invention of perspective, which was to transform painting, is said to have come from the 13th century Arab Spain. Europe offered little in exchange except the technology of gunnery. In the Middle Ages, Europe owed more to Islam than to any other contemporary source. For all their dramatic and exotic interest, the travels of a Marco Polo or the missionary wanderings of friars in Central Asia did little to change the West. The quantity of goods exchanged with other parts of the world was still tiny, even in 1500. Technically, Europe owed for certain to the Far East only the art of making silk, which had reached her from the Eastern Empire, and paper, which, though made in China in the 2nd century AD, took until the 13th to reach Europe and then did so again by the way of Arab Spain. Nor did the ideas reach Europe from nearer Asia, unless, like Indian mathematics, they had undergone refinement in the Arabic crucible. Given the permeability of Islamic culture, it seems less likely that this was because, in some sense, Islam insulated Europe from the Orient by imposing a barrier between them, than because China and India were simply too far away. They had hardly been accessible after all in pre Christian antiquity when communications had been no more difficult. The reintegration of classical and Christian, though manifested in work like that of Aquinas, was an answer 10 centuries late to Tertullian's jibbing question about what Athens had to do with Jerusalem. In one of the supreme works of art of the Middle Ages, some would judge the supreme, the Divine Comedy of Dante, the importance of reattachment of the world of Christendom to its predecessor is already to be seen. Dante describes his journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise, the universe of Christian truth. Yet, his guide is not a Christian but a pagan, the classical poet Virgil. This role is much more than decorative. Virgil is an authoritative guide to truth, for before Christ he foretold him. The Roman poet has become a prophet to stand beside those of the Old Testament. Though the notion of a link with antiquity had never quite disappeared, as attempts by enthusiastic chroniclers to link the Franks or the Britons to the descendants of the Trojans has shown. There is in Dante's attitude something marking an epoch. The acceptance of the classical world by Christendom for all the scholastic clutter of its surrounding had made possible a change which was usually been seen as more radical, the great revival of humanistic letters of the 14th to 16th centuries. It was a revival long dominated by Latin. Only in 1497 was the first Greek grammar to appear in print. One emblematic figure of that passage in cultural history was Erasmus of Rotterdam, sometime a monk, and later as the foremost exponent of classical studies of his day, the correspondent of most of the leading humanists. Yet he still saw his classics as the entrance to the supreme study of Scripture, and his most important book was an edition of the Greek New Testament. The effects of printing a good text of the Bible were, indeed, to be revolutionary, but Erasmus had no intention of overthrowing religious order, for all the vigor and wit with which he had mocked and teased puffed up churchmen, and for all the provocation to independent thought which his books and letters provided. His roots lay in the piety of a 15th century mystical movement in the Low Countries called the Devotio Moderna, not in pagan antiquity.